They betrayed you expecting noise, anger, begging, a reaction. So when you went silent, you didn't lose, you set a trap. Now they're trapped inside the echo of what they did. The cruelest punishment is not yelling, it is not confrontation, it is not revenge, it is silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind that stays with them long after you're gone. When someone betrays you, they expect collapse. They expect you to fight, to explain, to break, because reaction is how they confirm control. But when you give them nothing, no anger, no words, no closure, your silence becomes the loudest consequence of all. This isn't weakness, it's discipline, it's strategy. And in this video, you'll understand why silence doesn't just protect you, it dismantles them. Stay with me, because once you understand the psychology behind Stoic silence, you'll never feel the need to raise your voice again. 1. Silence is the punishment they never expected. There's a reason betrayal is never impulsive. It comes with expectation. The person who betrayed you already rehearsed the outcome in their mind. They imagined your reaction long before they acted. They expected anger. They expected confrontation. They expected tears, questions, explanations, some visible proof that what they did still had power over you. Because reaction is currency. Reaction is how betrayers confirm control. In their internal narrative, your emotional collapse would justify their behavior. It would turn guilt into dominance. It would allow them to say, "See, this is why I did it." But silence disrupted everything. Silence was never part of their plan. When you didn't raise your voice, when you didn't demand answers, when you didn't chase clarity or closure, the script they wrote for you collapsed. Betrayers don't just wound, they expect to remain central. They want to be the storm you revolve around. They want your anger to keep them relevant, your sadness to keep them important, your confusion to keep them powerful. Not because they care about you, but because they care about control. If you fight back, they get to claim victimhood. If you pursue them, they feel desired. If you explain yourself, they stay psychologically connected. Every reaction feeds the illusion. But when you go quiet, when you remove yourself without drama, that illusion dies. Silence cuts access, and access is everything to someone who betrays. Without your reactions, they lose their emotional anchor. Without your explanations, they lose narrative control. Without your presence, they lose the role they cast themselves in. They are no longer the antagonist in a story. They are no longer the misunderstood hero. They are just alone. And that is when discomfort turns into panic. Because silence doesn't give them anything to work with. No angles, no leverage, no emotional handles to grab onto. Your silence doesn't confront them. It corners them. It forces them into the one place they avoid at all costs, self-reflection. And for someone who survives on deflection, that space is unbearable. This is why silence feels so heavy to a betrayer. Not because you attacked them, not because you punished them, but because you refused to absorb the emotional burden of what they did. You didn't carry their guilt. You didn't validate their narrative. You didn't play the role of the wounded one they could explain away. You simply withdrew, and in that withdrawal, power shifted. Silence is not weakness. It is restraint. It is emotional discipline. And discipline terrifies those who depend on chaos to feel alive, because chaos needs noise, and silence starves it. 2. Why silence triggers their inner collapse. Silence doesn't just unsettle a betrayer. It dismantles the mental structure they rely on to survive. Because betrayal is rarely about strength. It's about escape. Escape from accountability. Escape from guilt. Escape from the uncomfortable truth of who they were in that moment. And silence removes every escape at once. When there's noise, they can redirect attention. When there's argument, they can rewrite the narrative. When there's emotion, they can claim confusion, misunderstanding, or provocation. But silence offers none of that. No cover, no distraction, no emotional shelter. This is where their control begins to fracture. Betrayers rely heavily on projection. They assume you will respond the way they would. If they were hurt, they would spiral. If they were abandoned, they would rage. If they were ignored, they would chase validation. So they build their expectations around that assumption. They imagine your anger feeding their importance, your pain proving their influence, your reaction confirming their power. But when you don't respond, when you remain composed, distant, self-contained, their internal model collapses. They can't locate themselves anymore. They begin replaying moments they thought were finished. They reanalyze conversations that once felt controlled. They question details they assumed were insignificant. Because your silence introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty is terrifying to someone who depends on dominance. They ask themselves, why aren't they reacting? Why aren't they asking questions? Why aren't they trying to fix this? And beneath those questions lies a deeper fear. What if I didn't win? Silence plants doubt where certainty once lived. It suggests that you may understand more than you're revealing, that you may see them more clearly than they're comfortable with, that your calm is not confusion, but clarity. And that realization cuts deeply, because now the power dynamic reverses. They no longer feel superior. They feel exposed. You are no longer the emotional variable they can manipulate. You are no longer predictable. You are no longer accessible. And to a betrayer, loss of access feels like loss of control. This is when the inner unraveling begins. They become restless, irritable, obsessive. They start creating stories about your silence, calling it cold, calling it arrogant, calling it cruel. But those labels are defenses, because what they are actually experiencing is the discomfort of being left alone with themselves. Your silence stripped away their distractions. No one is absorbing their guilt. No one is validating their justification. No one is reacting in a way that lets them avoid responsibility. So memory takes over. They remember the moment they crossed the line, the calculation behind it, the ease with which they rationalized it. And now there's no emotional noise to drown that out. This is the collapse no one witnesses. Not dramatic, not public, internal, a quiet erosion of certainty. They feel it late at night, in moments of stillness, when there's nothing left to blame. Silence didn't attack them. It removed the shield they were hiding behind. And without that shield, their own conscience becomes the loudest voice in the room. That's why silence feels unbearable to the guilty. Not because you punished them, but because you refused to protect them from the truth. 3. Silence becomes the mirror. They can't escape. Silence does not argue. It does not interrupt. It does not correct. And that is precisely why it becomes unbearable. As long as you were present, there was movement. As long as there was movement, there was distraction. As long as there was distraction, they could avoid seeing themselves clearly. But silence removes motion. It freezes the moment exactly where it happened. No emotional noise, no reaction to hide behind, no conversation to steer, just stillness. And stillness exposes. Without your responses, they lose their reference point. They can't measure dominance, they can't test control, they can't provoke reassurance or resistance. They are left alone with memory. Memory does not negotiate. The mind begins replaying moments not to win an argument, but to resolve a contradiction. They told themselves they were justified. They told themselves you deserved it. They told themselves you were too sensitive, too weak, too replaceable. But your silence introduces a fracture in that story, because weak people don't leave quietly. Confused people don't withdraw cleanly. Emotionally dependent people don't disappear without explanation. Your silence contradicts the role they assigned you. And when reality contradicts belief, the mind destabilizes. They begin questioning the past in fragments. The moment you stopped explaining, the shift in your tone before you went quiet, the calm way you exited without demanding anything. Those details replay, slowly, obsessively, because they don't fit the narrative of superiority they built. This is where silence becomes a mirror. Not because it reflects you, but because it reflects them. They start hearing their own words as if spoken to someone else. They see their actions without emotional cushioning. They feel the weight of intent without your presence absorbing it. And that weight settles. Silence creates no counter-argument, no defense, no distraction. It forces recognition. They realize something deeply unsettling. You didn't need closure. You didn't need validation. You didn't need to be right. You needed distance. That realization strips away the last illusion of control, because control requires participation, and you removed yourself completely. You didn't stay to explain your pain. You didn't remain available to be misunderstood. You didn't linger to soften the consequences. You left. And in that departure, you handed them something they cannot return: full ownership of what they did. This is why silence lingers, long after anger would have burned out, long after arguments would have faded, long after words would have lost impact. Because silence doesn't end, it echoes, not in the world, in the mind. They carry it into quiet moments, into late nights, into pauses between distractions. And in those pauses, the mirror appears again, not accusing, not condemning, just present. And that presence forces them to sit with a truth they never planned to face. You saw who they were, and you didn't stay. Silence didn't shame them, it clarified them. And once someone is seen that clearly, there is no escape. 4. Silence removes access, and access is their lifeline. Most people think betrayal ends at the moment it happens. The Stoics understood it continues through access. Betrayers rarely want clean endings. They want continued presence, not because they regret what they did, but because access keeps them powerful. Access to your reactions, access to your emotions, access to your confusion, your forgiveness, your desire for closure. That access is oxygen. As long as they can reach you in any form, anger, sadness, explanation, even silence broken by response, they remain psychologically relevant, and relevance is control. This is why silence feels so severe to them, because silence is not passive distance, it is enforced absence. When you stop responding, when you stop explaining, when you stop checking their name or replaying their words, you remove their point of entry. They are no longer inside your emotional field. And people who rely on manipulation do not survive without access. They are accustomed to influence, to adjustment, to emotional availability on demand. Silence disrupts that entirely. There is no handle to pull, no guilt to activate, no confusion to exploit. You become unreachable. This is when internal anxiety begins. They test the boundary, quietly at first. A casual message, a memory shared, a question framed as concern, not because they seek repair, but because they seek confirmation. Confirmation that they still matter, that they still exist in your emotional world, that they still have leverage. And when nothing comes back, the reality sets in. They are not just ignored, they are disconnected. And disconnection is intolerable to someone who needs control. Silence communicates a truth they cannot argue with. You no longer grant access, not to your attention, not to your emotions, not to your inner narrative. And access was the last thread holding power together. This is why silence feels brutal to the guilty, not because it injures, but because it denies. It denies them the opportunity to reshape meaning, to soften responsibility, to stay psychologically attached. You are no longer participating. Without your participation, their story loses structure. They can't justify themselves to you. They can't correct their image in your eyes. They can't negotiate the ending. They are left alone with consequence. Silence removes permission. Permission to disturb, permission to intrude, permission to rewrite. You didn't announce a boundary, you embodied it, and that embodiment is final. For someone who survives on access, losing access is catastrophic, because the moment you became unreachable, you stopped being manageable. And when you stop being manageable, control shifts completely. Silence didn't threaten them. It ended the relationship on your terms, without explanation. 5. They collapse because silence forces accountability. There is one thing betrayers fear more than being exposed: being left alone with themselves. As long as someone is reacting to them, they can redirect responsibility outward. They can argue. They can justify, they can blame circumstances, emotions, misunderstandings. Your reaction gave them movement, and movement gave them escape. But silence removes escape. When you stopped responding, there was nowhere left to project the weight of what they did. No argument to hide inside, no emotional exchange to dilute guilt, no reaction to twist into a justification. And that's when accountability arrives. Not announced, not dramatic, quiet. It settles slowly, like something heavy finally finding the bottom. They replay the betrayal, not to excuse it, but because the mind is searching for relief. But there is none, because without your emotional participation, their internal logic breaks down. The phrases they once used to soothe themselves start sounding hollow. It wasn't that bad. They'll get over it. They pushed me to it. Those explanations need a listener to survive. Silence starves them. And so the mind turns inward. They feel tension without knowing why, restlessness without direction, irritation without a target. They assume they're angry at you. But that's not what it is. It's unresolved guilt, circulating without release. Guilt normally escapes through one of 3 paths: confession, justification, or forgiveness. Silence blocks all 3. You didn't give them confrontation. You didn't give them absolution. You didn't give them closure. So the guilt stays. It has nowhere to go. This is why they begin lashing out in subtle ways. They rewrite the story publicly. They label you cold, heartless, dramatic, arrogant. Not because they believe it, but because they need a villain again. Because without a villain, they are left holding the truth alone. And the truth is heavy. Silence doesn't accuse them. It removes the emotional cushioning that once softened their actions. They begin to realize something deeply unsettling. You didn't punish them. You didn't seek revenge. You didn't demand accountability. You simply stopped carrying their burden. And when someone realizes they were relying on you to absorb the emotional cost of their behavior, and you no longer are, the collapse begins. Not outwardly, not in ways others see, internally. Their nights feel louder, their thoughts loop longer, their justifications lose effectiveness, because consequences delivered by people can be argued with. Consequences delivered by silence cannot. Silence doesn't attack. It doesn't threaten. It lets reality finish the conversation. And once reality takes over, there is no one left to negotiate with. That is where real authority begins. 6. Silence becomes the boundary. They can't cross. At some point, silence stops being interpreted as distance and starts being felt as a boundary. Not a boundary you announced, not a boundary you defended, a boundary that simply exists. This is what unsettles them the most. They are used to boundaries that can be negotiated, explained away, worn down over time. They know how to argue past words. They know how to pressure emotions. They know how to exhaust people into compliance. But silence offers nothing to negotiate with. It has no emotional surface, no justification, no opening. When you went quiet, you didn't just remove yourself from the conflict, you removed the possibility of return. And that realization hits slowly. At first, they assume it's temporary, that you'll cool down, that you'll reach out once the intensity fades, because that's what usually happens. But time passes, and the silence holds. That's when anxiety replaces assumption. They begin to feel the absence as something solid, something intentional, something irreversible. Because silence, when sustained, becomes unmistakable. It says, this is not a phase, this is not a tactic, this is a decision. And decisions terrify people who rely on emotional flexibility to survive. They begin testing the edge of the boundary. A casual message, a memory resurfaced, a question framed as closure or concern, not because they need answers, but because they need proof the boundary isn't real. They need reassurance that access still exists somewhere. But silence doesn't bend, it doesn't clarify, it doesn't soften, it doesn't explain itself. It remains. And that permanence is what shifts power completely, because boundaries enforced through language invite resistance. Boundaries enforced through behavior eliminate it. Silence is behavior. It doesn't argue its authority, it embodies it. This is when they begin to feel something deeper than frustration, loss of control, not over you, but over the situation they once thought they managed. They realize something too late. You are no longer reacting. You are no longer negotiating. You are no longer available. You are not emotionally present enough to be manipulated. And that absence of access feels like rejection at the deepest level. Not rejection of them as a person, but rejection of their influence. You didn't close the door loudly. You didn't slam it. You didn't explain why it was closing. You simply locked it and walked away. That quiet finality is devastating to someone who depends on emotional proximity to feel powerful. Because now, even if they wanted to fix things, there is no path back. Not because you are cruel, but because you are clear. Silence didn't punish them. It defined the boundary they never thought you'd enforce. And once a boundary is enforced without words, it no longer needs defending. It simply stands. 7. You win because you no longer need closure. There is a moment where silence stops being painful and starts being freeing. That moment is when you realize you no longer need them to explain, apologize, or understand. Closure is what keeps most people trapped. They think peace will come after one last conversation, one final explanation, one moment where the other person finally admits the truth. But the Stoics understood something deeper. Closure given by others is unreliable. Closure built within yourself is permanent. The moment you went silent, you didn't abandon the conversation. You ended your dependence on it. You stopped waiting for permission to move on. You stopped hoping they would suddenly become self-aware. You stopped handing your peace to someone who had already mishandled it. That is where victory happens. Not loudly, not dramatically, internally. Because the person who needs closure is still psychologically attached. They are still negotiating meaning, still waiting for validation, still emotionally invested in an outcome they can't control. But the moment you no longer need answers, you take back ownership of your inner world. Silence becomes self-contained. You don't replay conversations anymore. You don't rehearse what you should have said. You don't imagine future confrontations, not because you forgot, but because you resolved it internally. This is the shift they never anticipate. They expect silence to be temporary, a pause before another attempt to connect. But when silence becomes permanent, they realize something too late. You didn't leave to make a point. You left because you were finished. Finished explaining. Finished absorbing emotional weight. Finished hoping for change. And that finality is what unsettles them most. Because closure denies them a role. They don't get to justify themselves. They don't get to correct the story. They don't get to rewrite the ending. You close the chapter without their participation. And once closure comes from within, nothing external can reopen it. You no longer seek understanding from someone committed to misunderstanding you. You no longer need acknowledgement from someone who crossed your boundaries. You no longer wait for an apology to validate your worth. That is Stoic victory, not dominance over another person, but sovereignty over yourself. And when you reach that point, silence is no longer a weapon. It becomes peace, the kind that doesn't need to be explained, the kind that doesn't ask permission, the kind that doesn't look back. Final closing. Silence is the ultimate authority. Silence is not avoidance. It is resolution. It is the moment you stop asking to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding you. You didn't lose your voice. You reclaimed your power. You didn't walk away because you were weak. You walked away because you were done carrying weight that was never yours to hold. And here's the truth most people never learn. When you stop reacting, you stop being controlled. No explanation can do what silence does. No confrontation can expose what absence reveals. No revenge cuts deeper than dignity. They expected noise. They expected chaos. They expected you to break. What they never expected was your calm. And that calm became the consequence. So if you're watching this and you've chosen silence, if you've walked away without closure, if you've protected your peace instead of your ego, know this: you didn't lose anything. You outgrew it, and growth is always quiet. If this message resonated with you, if you're learning to master restraint, discipline, and inner strength. Subscribe to Think Stoic 101. This channel isn't about motivation. It's about control, clarity, and becoming unshakable in a world that feeds on reaction. Leave a comment if silence became your turning point. Your story may help someone else choose peace over noise. And if you know someone who's struggling to let go, share this with them. Not to stir conflict, but to remind them, silence isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Stay grounded, stay disciplined, and let silence do the speaking.